All right. Hello, everyone. So we are going to finish chapter 5 for class on March 1st. I am also going to start chapter 6 because we will have a bit of room or time rather. So where we left off, we were getting ready to move into blues and rock. So remember that we are looking at songs as they pertain to music specifically throughout history. We started with art songs. We've looked at different spirituals. We've looked at work songs. We've looked at jazz. We've looked at the blues. So now we are looking at blues and rocks and how they kind of intermingle or work together, rather. So you're going to see this intersection of two different genres in the 60s and 70s. Okay. So it's really this we're taking the best of both worlds. Your PowerPoint is going to have it listed as blues being coupled with the driving power of rock and roll. This is going to be something that is primarily brought on by English bands. We do see, different people delving into this kind of music making. However, English people specifically, and oddly enough, this is where it takes off. So it's going to be very straightforward in its conception and its performance, but it's going to be a lot of energy. So it's going to be highly charged and it's recreating the blues. So, people to look out for when we talk about this genre of music, or this hybrid rather, is going to be Eric Clapton, John Mayall, Blues Breakers, the Yardbirds, Cream, and then Derek and the Dominoes. Okay, so the first example you need to listen to is going to be Crossroads by Robert Johnson and then performed by Cream. So go ahead and pause your video now and listen to it here. Okay, so then as we leave this idea of rock and roll, or rock and roll, blues and rock, we're going to move into heavy metal. So there are a lot of connotations that many people associate this type of music with, not necessarily positive, right? So a lot of these connotations that heavy metal carries with it is it's going to be aggressive, it's high energy, it's um, synonymous in the public's mind with long hair, uncleanliness, sex, drugs, satanic connections. And, on some level, these assumptions, these bases might be founded in some way, but generally speaking, it's untrue, right? And you talk to anybody who is a fan of these different types of music, and they'll often argue that these are misconceptions of these types of musics. And we'll even continue to talk about those misconceptions as we go through this lecture today. Heavy metal specifically is going to have a lot of improvisation. So as we look at the end of this class, we're going to talk a lot more about improvisation. But what improvisation essentially is when people have a foundation set in music, but they just make up something on the spot or they riff. And so they take what they're hearing and they add to it without having a structured piece of music or a written piece of music in front of them. And it's actually quite fascinating to watch. So, more connotations with heavy metal, it's going to be potentially controversial. This is really dependent on the listener. Please remember that. So, but heavy metal is also going to spawn many sub styles of metal. We won't get into that right now, though. So, different artists to look out for are going to be Judas Priest, Black Sabbath, Metallica. So here you are going to stop and listen to Seek and Destroy by Metallica. Okay, so now country. We kind of talked a bit about a predecessor of country, but now we're at country specifically. So country is going to have its roots in folk music from the United States. So this is very much a North America conception in terms of the music being created. We also have subgenre styles. Bluegrass, there are going to be people that argue that it's not a sub style of country. It And I personally agree with this. You're going to look at bluegrass as more of kind of an offset of country. They share similarities, but it's not, one is not directly reflective of the other, if that makes sense. Western swing, however, there is a direct correlation to country. And when you listen to them, you can hear those direct correlations. I think sometimes where the mistake is made is the way that things sound. So the harmonies or potentially the instrumentation and the way those instrumentations are used. So Nashville then is going to be like the epicenter for country music. And even still today, this is very much the case. We find a lot of country music being recorded in Nashville. We have a lot of recording artists coming out of Nashville. Southern accent is going to be very common. You also have this very, almost nasal like quality, even though it may not quite be someone speaking or singing rather through their nose. People to look out for as prominent artists: Hank Williams, Patsy Cline, Merle Haggard, Waylon Jennings, Johnny Cash. Um, More recent names: Garth Brooks, Luke Bryan, Taylor Swift. Even if you are a big Swiftie fan, you'll know that she kind of started off her music career on the country end of things, even though we might classify her now a little more as a pop artist. Okay, so this is where you will pause your video and listen to Folsom Prison Blues by Johnny Cash. Okay, so then pop music. So pop music is still a relatively new genre of music in its conception. It, just like music in general, just like classic music, the genre has been developing and it's continuously developing over time. But we're only looking at potentially a span of about 40 years for pop music specifically. So you think about something like classical music that's been, and we talk about this larger genre of classical music, you know, that has roots back from the 500s, and we're now into the 2000s. There's a significant difference in the amount of time that music has developed, right? So we can make an argument that pop music has developed from classical music, even though we now treat them as different genres. Semantics, we won't get into it. So pop music does something really cool, and it crosses generational and racial lines, right? And so we give music this or music rather has this innate power to connect people on a completely different level than what we find other words, other languages being able to do, right? And it music is not defined by looks, right? So it doesn't matter how you look. Music is music. Music is going to sound the way music sounds. Okay, so we see a lot of love songs, power ballads. They come from this kind of pop music beginning. Most pop music is going to have this form of verse, chorus, bridge, and may have an introduction of some kind, right? And so you take any pop song and try and fit it into this narrative or this kind of framework, and you're going to find that it's very, very close to, if not actually. So high quality recordings and the backing of large recording studios are hallmarks of pop music. Duh. So pop music, right? So we talked about the recording industry really being this big catalyst for music. And when it comes to pop, this is definitely the case. Names to look out for. Remember, we're talking about 40 years: Elton John, Whitney Houston, Queen, Celine Dion, Britney Spears, and Michael Jackson. And there is a myriad of other artists that we could also potentially put in this genre. Okay, so now you are going to listen to Billie Jean by Michael Jackson. So something that Michael Jackson really set the precedent for was using MTV as a means of gathering a wider audience. So if people didn't necessarily listen to his music, but they were watching MTV, he is getting audiences through MTV, right? So something that I absolutely love that Michael Jackson does is the amount of money he puts into his music videos. And we talk about like Thriller specifically. For that time, Thriller had a budget of what we would see for a major motion picture. And we're talking like big Hollywood blockbuster, right? And so this is all funded by Michael Jackson, mind you. He's paying for the production. But that's why we find, and it's very interesting if you've never seen the Thriller music video, one, why it's so long, but two, the quality for the time of that music video is very much akin to the videos or the movies that you might see in a theater. Okay, so then we talk about alternative rock. This is that we have um, rock and roll, we have heavy metal, alternative rock. So remember, history is developing, it's evolving. Alternative rock is kind of, or people want it to be like the antithesis of something, right? And we might call it the antithesis of rock or the opposite of rock, but it's still considered rock in its conception. So it's going to grow out of punk rock in the 70s, right? But this is why we might consider it the antithesis is because it's going against the narrative. It's going against the mainstream. It's going against the norm, right? So this is going to be very college music based. People are up in their feelings, they want to establish themselves. There's generally an issue of being or having, sorry, there's generally an image set of having authority issues when we talk about alternative rock, punk rock, etc. And so and we get this impression because these bands, these musicians are avoiding the conventions that we might see across other genres of music related to rock specifically, or alternative rock rather. And then what alternative rock does, that is something I like. Remember, we're going against the convention. We're going against the norm. It's not normal to talk about our issues, right? And still as a society, we sometimes have issues with that. Punk rock does exactly that. Punk rock has many times and many times over addressed different issues and social issues for that matter. So then when we talk about these artists, we can look at REM, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Red Hot Chili Peppers. Again, this is not an exhaustive list by any means of alternative rock groups and or musicians. Okay, so then take the time to listen to these two pieces of music, Jeremy by Pearl Jam and then Higher Ground by the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Okay, so now we're going to get into rap and hip hop, and I've kind of touched on these, or rather the culture's expectations of these different kinds of music. So rap is going to be a rhythm-based music that we find really take off in the 70s. The rap and hip hop have these connotations, much like heavy metal, that generally are negative, that have been fed by a societal narrative. And so what I mean by this is people are uncomfortable with it. The music makes them uncomfortable. So suddenly rap and hip hop have this bad image. So different image associations that rap and hip hop have with them are going to be graffiti art, break dancing, baggy clothing, excessive jewelry. And as a society, this vilification has happened, or people have been turned into villains, so to speak, because of their association with music, either because they consume this music or because they are performers of this music. But it's literally just a branch of music as we have seen it develop throughout history, right? So why is there this issue with it? And again, it comes back because it's not normal. So this music then is going to be originally performed by DJs in clubs. This is where we see it generate. And, to oversimplify rap, it's going to be spoken word over rhythmic accompaniment, right? And so an artist that everyone should be aware of and look up, Google, try and find recordings of, is going to be Run DMC. This is going to be one of the first, if not the first, successful commercial artists, right? So we have different artists that we can talk about within this genre. We have Kanye, we have Tupac, Nelly, Bow Wow, Wiz Khalifa, depending on when your foray into rap and hip hop have kind of stemmed. Um, we also have to mention the social issue of appropriation. And Eminem, we all know, is a white man. Um, but he is still credited as the most commercially successful rap artist. The issue is that rap was not conceptually conceived, was not was not conceptually conceived by white people, right? And so we talked about music kind of being used sometimes in the wrong situations as a means of maintaining power or the status quo. And unfortunately, this is one of those cases. And while I cannot speak to Eminem directly and what his feelings are, etc., that is the way this comes across when you have someone who is taking a genre that isn't necessarily from their heritage or background, but then finding their success in it, right? And so that's where the appropriation comes in, is that he is taking something developed by others for his own personal success. I do realize that's a very hot take and that there is a lot of controversy behind that. I am more than happy to have a conversation with someone if you would like to discuss this further, but it just is what it is when we look at this idea of appropriation versus who originated this kind of material or this kind of music. Okay. So then make sure that you listen to all of these. We're going to look at Hard Times by Run DMC. I'm pretty sure all of you have heard this. It's a very popular song. Lose Yourself by Eminem, and then Swagga Like Us with T.I., Jay-Z, and Lil Wayne. Okay. So then since 2000, music is still evolving, right? So there is a relative equality, and that's not completely true, of songs hitting number one by female and male artists. Maybe that part is true. The amount of representation is definitely not equal, but that's a rabbit hole we won't go down. Popular music styles have remained fairly static. That is true. Um, but don't forget, right? We're talking about this span of almost 2,000 years that we have watched music develop, and we are but a smidgen of that entire timeline, right? So there is every chance that music may not potentially develop so much within our lifetime, and that's okay. Um, so then kind of along those lines, we the no significant new styles have emerged since the reduced influence of big record companies in the internet age. So again, record companies have a lot of power, right? And so they get to have, because they have the money, because they are funding all of this music, they are going to have a direct say in the path that music takes and how music develops. Controversy in music, so coming back to this idea that we see with rap, with heavy metal, is going to depend on a listener's point of view and their background. So I'm going to challenge you, and you don't have to put this anywhere, or maybe I'll make these your questions to answer, but rather, uh, do lyrics for music share a story from someone's point of view, or are they projecting an image? And this is a very deep thought and complicated question. So please take the time to answer this thoughtfully. Then, secondly, are you a melodic listener or a lyric listener? Oftentimes, this is very telling on what kind of music you like to listen to. Melodic listeners are going to be people who listen to music for the melodies, for the way that things change within music. So, a lot of the time, classical musicians are going to fall into this kind of realm, or people who listen to classical music rather. Lyric listeners or word listeners are going to be the people who kind of fall on the opposite end of the spectrum. So if you like the meanings behind words, if you like the stories that words are telling, chances are you may potentially like music that's a bit more pop, rap, hip hop in nature, even something like musical theater where there's a lot of words versus something like classical music where we really don't have words as much unless we're talking about like choral pieces or opera. And then most songs at this point are derived from already established styles. So if we go all the way back to the 12 bar blues, remember I talked about how we took this framework that the 12 bar blues set up and we still use it today in popular music, right? And because it works, because it allows catchy music to be played. The issue with that is we're it almost sometimes feels like we're reinventing the wheel or we are recreating things, right? So you hear about these different lawsuits between artists and you want to be supportive of an artist, their right to do whatever they want, right? But at the same time, if we're using the same framework for everything, one has to think or argue we're bound to repeat ourselves at some time, right? So anyways, food for thought. Okay, so then some final listenings to make sure you take care of for this chapter. Make sure you listen to DJ Got Us Falling in Love by Usher, Find Your Love by Drake, Mean by Taylor Swift, and then Hello by Adele. So, if you have any questions about this chapter specifically, please do not hesitate to email me. We will take just a second and then I will get started with chapter 6. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with chapter 6. I'm only going to do the first few slides. Um, okay, so we are going to talk about music for morning. And so when we talk about music for morning, we're looking at a general broad worldview of how people use music as a means of mourning or how music may influence potential potential death rituals and or ceremonies and happenings. Okay, so we would be remiss if we did not mention the Requiem Mass because they have played such a large role in the history of music that we study. So a Requiem Mass is going to be a mass that commemorates someone's death. The requiems then are going to use the proper text of the mass. So remember that the proper is going to be text for specific masses or feast days in the liturgical calendar. So there is going to be a set of movements and or words that are used for these masses because they deal with death specifically. Um, you will also find that they are going to have the framework and groundwork set for the text from the ordinary part of the Mass. So remember that the ordinary is the part of the Mass that we see on a weekly basis because we need to have some sort of framework set for the liturgical calendar or for when things within the liturgical calendar are not happening and we need to use up that time between different events. So the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Credo, the Sanctus, and then the Agnus Dei are going to be the 5 most common movements that we see. But again, there are going to be proper parts of masses for these Requiem masses. So we find these different masses. They are going to be written in honor of different individuals, people killed in war, composers confronting a sense of their own mortality. We look at people like Mozart, who this is very much the case, and I believe we listen to him in just a second. So this is going to be something that is happening throughout history since the medieval era. However, we kind of see this uptick in the composition of requiem masses in the Renaissance. Okay, so requiem mass texts, proper texts from the Roman Catholic Mass. So we're looking at things like the Requiem Aeternam, the Lacrimosa, the Dies Irae, the Domine Jesu. Sorry, my Latin's a little rusty, but these are all translated here for you to look at. And as you read the lyrics, it's very easy to see why there's this association with death when we talk about these movements specifically. So then the proper texts continued are going to be Pie Jesu, Lux Aeternam, Liberame, and then In Paradisum. So again, texts that generally are going to deal with death and or the afterlife, potentially meeting the creator, etc. Okay, so then the Requiem Mass can be performed in a concert hall or a church. Because the Requiem Mass does have religical text, the masses themselves can be used in a religious context, right? So when we see them performed in a concert hall, there's usually going to be a very large instrumentation. So we look at something like Verdi's Requiem, where it's this like 150-piece orchestra, which you almost even never see on a normal symphonic stage. So there's a lot of people in the same place. Then behind that 150-piece orchestra, you have a 200-person choir. So it's an obscene amount of people to have on a stage for a singular work of music. Now, I will say, if you ever have the ability to go listen to one of these pieces, it is absolutely mind-blowing because of the amount of stage. It's like being surrounded by like this cocoon of sound. So then requiems we might see performed in a church are going to have smaller instrumentation, potentially something like Mozart's Requiem Mass, or Fauré's Requiem. So, okay, we are going to stop here, and then I will pick back up when I see you all next with the Dies Irae, and we will listen to different examples of the Dies Irae. Again, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me. I will be available by email if you need me. Additionally, please be on the lookout for an email about class being canceled on, give me just a second to pull open my calendar, for class being canceled on the 11th, but I will send that out in an email to confirm. Okay, I hope you all have a fabulous spring break. Please enjoy your time off.